Welcome to the Industry of UX, number 8. In this episode, Paul Pittman and I had a chance to sit down with Alex Genov, PhD, Head of Customer Research at Zappos. We talked about the psychology and customer behavior during the pandemic and how companies react and adapt to COVID. You can subscribe to the Industry of UX from your favorite podcast app, and you can check out theindustryofux.com for show notes, episode details, and to leave comments and feedback. You can also make a small donation or buy our new gorgeous stickers on our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/the industry of UX. As always, let's dive right in with a question. Alex, can you give us a brief intro about yourself?
Originally, I'm from Bulgaria, and I grew up in communist Bulgaria, had to serve in the army for 2 years. It was mandatory at the time, and then right around the time when communism was falling apart and I was about to get out of the army, I heard that colleges in the US were accepting students from Eastern Europe and giving them scholarships. So I decided to give it a shot, and I applied to a few places, and then one accepted me and gave me a scholarship. So that's how I ended up in the US. And I was interested in psychology. I was reading this pop psychology author, Wayne Dyer, back in the day in Bulgaria. So maybe that's how I got interested. But that's how I got started in the field of psychology. And then because I was a foreign student on an F1 visa, the only chance I had to stay in the US was to continue studying. So I went on to get a graduate degree, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to stick around here. So I did that and studied psychology essentially for 10 years. And then at the end of my academic career, the next natural move was going to be to become a professor. But it was extremely hard to get a good professor position. I didn't have enough research, papers, publications at the time. So I started to panic after I got my degree. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was living in Seattle at the time. And I had to do a bunch of odd jobs like loading UPS trucks. And I did data entry for about 2 days before I was ready to kill myself. And so I quit that. And I started doing online searches for jobs. And this was, mind you, year 2000. And I would put in psychology as a keyword, and usability started coming up in companies like Microsoft and Boeing and so on. So I got the book Usability Engineering by Jacob Nielsen, which was still pretty trendy back then, and read it and found out that it was just applied psychology research, right? All of the methods, the research method back from the psychology field, just applied to the industry, to corporations. So I decided to give it a go and started applying for jobs. And one really cool guy in an online company in Seattle, online agency, gave me a chance. And I started there, and it was the first .com bust at the time. So I had to do like 6 months of unpaid internship with him. And then I was starting to apply to jobs at Microsoft all over the place. And then at some point, after I got some experience, I found a job with State Farm Insurance. And this was in their usability department. And the usability was a huge field back in the day. So they had invested in a multi-million-dollar usability lab. There were 5 of us doing a lot of usability work at State Farm. Just the engineering department was 6,000 people, 6,000 developers back in 2001.
Whoa.
So I did 3 years there in the Midwest, but then I was ready to move on. And then I joined Intuit for the TurboTax division in San Diego, excuse me, which was again usability, again a big usability lab. A lot of interesting work there. I worked with awesome designers and editors. Intuit had a great UX discipline. I mean, they're really well known for they're first and foremost a UX company. I mean, they do taxes, but right now it's just they're improving the user experience, right? All these years. So, and then I joined another smaller company in which I learned a lot of other interesting areas of research, like market research, segmentation, that sort of thing, analytics. And then when I joined Zappos, I started applying all of that. But so that's basically it in a nutshell.
That is a very interesting story. I wanted to ask you, especially with this big push from COVID to move online, a lot of folks that had careers that were not necessarily tied to the online environment are now thinking about moving to online jobs. And definitely UX is finding a new push. I see it firsthand with the mentoring that I do. Let's talk about user research. With UX design being so prominent right now, where do you see the overlap between user experience design and user research?
I mean, you out of all people already know that really well, Philip, because you're practicing this at Zappos, right? Because you're doing user experience is not just design. User experience is creating products and services for people based on their needs. That's what it should be, at least, right? So let's say you're designing for one person and you know them really well, you're designing for yourself, right? You don't need to do research unless you want to create a survey, take it, then interview yourself, right? Then observe yourself. So my point is, in some cases, maybe you don't need to do research. But if you are designing for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and that's what I bring to the table from my psychology academic career, is that there's individual differences. Not everybody is the same. And especially when it comes to attitudes, to inner states, right? When it comes to human factors, I mean, a lot of us have, a lot in common in terms of the human factors, like vision and hearing, right? Of course, it's also a spectrum of there's disabilities and there's various levels of ability and so on. But in general, we share a lot of that. But when it comes to attitudes and knowledge and experiences, right, we differ a lot. So without finding out what people need and what they want and what they struggle with, how are you going to design and develop different solutions for them?
Yep. You know what I find really interesting is that, since we're talking about COVID as well, is that there's an obvious change in the mental model of what people are dealing with today, right? And I'm always been curious on that because let's say this time last year, right? It's the holidays and people are shopping and spending money and all that kind of stuff. So they're thinking, is different than it is today, where we're dealing with this, this pandemic. And I'm always been curious to know, like, especially from Alex's side, what does that mean for the psyche? Like, when you're dealing with something where you get depression and you've got, the economy is not doing that great, and there's all these other factors now that never really played a role when it comes to what we do day to day for UX and for user research. What do you think that means now that we're in this pandemic, when people are now starting to change their attitudes, right? Do you have any feelings around that? Like, what do you think that means moving forward? Like, because we're going to still be in this spot, I think, for a couple more years. Like, it's not just that we're dealing with COVID and getting over that, but this carrying forward of thinking now, I guess one example that strikes me the most is like replenishable items like toilet paper and all that kind of stuff, right? So it wasn't such a major need before, but now it's like shelves are empty and all that kind of stuff and that kind of thing. And I've always wondered now, what do you think that means from the user side when they have to change their mental model on an experience based on what's happening with the world?
Yeah, awesome question, Paul. So, I've gotten that question a lot when I give when I'm on panels or am part of these engagements. So as a psychologist, I'm thinking about what's temporary and what's more lasting, right? What's general, what's specific, and I can tell you that our brains developed, tens of thousands of years ago, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we haven't we haven't changed much since then, right? So a pandemic is not going to change that. So think about when you think of basic needs, basic emotions, they change in the span. Our brains change in the span of tens of hundreds of thousands of years. So that's not going to have some kind of lasting effect, right? So I'm thinking, it's a crisis, but we've gone through these crises before, right? I mean, the US went through the Great Depression, and then afterwards it went back to, consumerism went back to normal, everything went back to normal, right? It's not that people changed dramatically because they went through that horrendous time, right? We've gone through wars, we've gone through really gnarly disasters and world crises. So I don't expect things to change really dramatically in terms of our psyche. But in the moment, I think things are changing, right? The economic hardship is making people make tougher decisions, right? So that there will be such changes, but if you ask me, I don't think there will be any drastic, emotional or psychological changes based on that.
See, that's really interesting because I think when I hear that, I'm thinking, this is also, you could put it under that sort of, this is a trend that we're going through, right? And as we know, trends come and go, right? And those things that are consistent stay consistent. So even when we look at this pandemic, because even when I look at my side of things, when I start to design for UX and, even in this weird space with, COVID and all this kind of stuff, that the changes that we're making, these are sort of like this intermediate buffer that we need to have in place until the dust settles, right? And some people might have a harder time from a UX side to understand, well, what does that mean for scaling? Does that mean then we take this away when we get back to normal, or do we evolve with what we have today? And that's really even for me on a day-to-day challenge on the UX side is how do you compensate for trends. Trends is a nice way of putting the word, substituting for the word pandemic. But when I think of a trend, it's something that's not going to stay consistent. It's not going to be around for very long or, at all at some point. And hearing that is reassuring to know that, from a UX side that we can design for the now, but understanding that for the future, this isn't going to stay this way.
Right. And there are definitely trends that will change the trajectory of, even human emotion, cognition. This technology that we're using will change our brains, right? Because now we rely on it so much that, we're using less of our memory, for example, right? Because everything is like, how many of us remember our phone numbers, right? And we used to use our memory more, and even now with my kids, they're on video games all the time, and I worry about that, right? And then I read this really interesting neurological research. It was a TED talk, I think, by a neurologist who explored that very question. And she basically said, if you overdo it, if your kids play video games for 8 hours a day, don't do anything else, that's really bad, right? But in moderation, it actually improves vision and improves attention and improves a lot of cognitive abilities and also physical reaction times and so on. So that's, to me, was a big aha and a bit of a relief, right? So using technology will change us, but it's going to take a long time. And then I think the question is, when we design experiences and products and services, what are the goals, right? If you're designing to make people purchase more things, right? You're actually influencing consumerism, the trend of consumerism, right? Versus you can be designing for things to slow down consumption, right? Or to really affect behavior. And that's where you get into the realm of behavioral economics, right? And you can really affect human behavior with tiny design changes, right? And I don't know if you guys have heard this. It's an example given by Danny Ariely about organ donor behavior in to neighboring European countries, and it was something like Denmark and Sweden, or some countries that were very similar. And when they looked at the rate of organ donorship after an accident, let's say, right, one was at 80+%, the other one was at 20% or something like this. And then you start thinking, are these different people and different cultures and whatnot? And it actually boiled down to how the application for the driver's license is designed, right? And in one case, the organ donor checkbox was pre-checked. You had to uncheck it, and the other one you had to check it, and that was all it took, right? So I think that gives you an idea of, right, when you design, are you designing for trends, but also are you creating behavior, and are you incentivizing behavior? I mean, these are big questions, right? But COVID, I think it's a crisis. It's a really terrible situation. If you ask me, it's kind of overblown by the media. The media sensationalizes a lot of the effects, I think, in a sense that not really the fact that people are suffering or dying. That's a terrible thing, right? But I think when they start making it a topic like, oh, everything is going to change now, right? I don't know how much will change. But anyway, I wanted to maybe ask Paul Paul, how in your work, how do you see user research playing in that?
Oh man, I hardly make a move without data. And I don't mean data as in like on the metric side, like Filippo was mentioning earlier. I look at it as in like, what are real pain points? And as you were talking, one particular one came to mind, and that is, with this pandemic that we're in, and everything kind of hit us really quickly. Things shut down pretty fast, and we're in the business of shipping items to customers, right? So, and they're used to getting it the same day or the next day or 2 days, right? I'm talking specifically Zappos, because that's your Zappos model, is they get, 3 to 5 day free shipping. And then there's like, what other offers where you get it next day. And I always thought to myself, okay, with all the shipping stuff, we're not going to be able to hit these promises. It's pretty sure about that. But when I looked at I'm going to say data again, but on the psychology side of the data, that when I looked at the information that I was getting from the quantitative feedback from our customers pre-COVID, a lot of it was more like, oh, well, I'm so happy to get my stuff the same day or 2 days, and it's great that it came on time. And then when they didn't get it on time, they were ticked, right? But then when everybody understood the way of the world with the shipping and everything else, I saw that quantitative data change, as in like, I haven't received my stuff yet. I understand we're going through difficult times. I'm hoping that I get it sooner. And when I looked at that, the level of urgency of understanding from the customer's perspective, that we have some really great customers, right? And I think we have some great individuals out there as well that think about this in their day-to-day. So instead of this rush of trying to solve the shipping issue, as in like, this is going to crash and burn us as a business, as an organization, bringing in that information to have that level of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Empathy coming from our customers to say, we understand what's happening. Yeah, I mean, some people still were not excited about the idea that things were coming late because of what was happening, but people understood what was happening. And then when you understand our users on that level, it becomes much more of a humane experience, as opposed to like a UX driven initiative, if that makes any sense. And I found that to be really, quite interesting. Now on the Amazon side, they had obviously less of that because their infrastructure is massive. So if something was going to come on time, it's going to come on time. They actually were pretty good at keeping their deadlines. But for those organizations like, outside of Zappos, that had probably gone through some of these pain points with shipping and stuff like that, and delivering items on time, or even just getting access to stuff, people were more willing to be okay with it because of what was happening. So when it came to my decision-making process, when I came to my UX, I looked at things of like, okay, what is on fire and what can we basically, douse for now, and fix other things that are just as important, if not more important, because our customers are understanding what's happening. And I've applied that I try to apply that whenever I can, but the biggest implementation of that was during this entire time that with COVID and the Zappos and the shipping promises and stuff. And I thought that was really quite interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think what it brings out is the fact that we talked earlier a bit about how we, with our design and business practices, condition people to do so, right? And I think Amazon, because it has been so operationally excellent, it got people to expect everything the next day, right? For Prime or very quickly. But if you think about it, really, if you bring it down to real needs, like some things you need quicker because you have an event, you have a deadline, and other things you don't, right? So I think that's the more interesting point of, and now businesses are starting to talk about sustainability and effects on the environment and so on. But I think that's the biggest question is how do we bring it down to that right level of real urgency versus the conditioned urgency of, oh, I just need it because I want it the next
Exactly.
day.
And I think what you're really saying is how do we measure that level of expectation? And I think that was one of the big fascinating things that has happened to me during COVID, being a UX designer, is that we measure our expectations within our stakeholders for sure. But on this time, it was a quite different level of expectation. And I thought that it was just interesting. And I think for, in particular for me, and I'm sure there's a handful of other people out there as well, but I'm in definitely a different situation when it comes to the fact that, I'm coming from Amazon, working with inside of Zappos. So I've kind of understand sort of both of these organizations and what they're going to be performing at, right? And then looking at this experience between customers on the Zappos side and then experience on the Amazon side is just quite different. It's very different. Especially when you deal with, I don't want to get too much into it, but when you look at a paid service, which is Prime on Amazon, there is that level of expectation that I don't care what's happening in the world. I'm paying for this service. Whereas Zappos, it's not a paid service. So you get a different thinking customer at that point, where they'd be like, just happy to get stuff, where, when it arrives. And then was on the Amazon side, it's, I paid for this and I'm supposed to get it now. And when you look at it on that perspective, it's almost humbling for a designer in a sense. I don't know how to best explain it, but you kind of take a step back a little and you just become a little bit more humble. And I'm been humble a lot lately with all of this stuff.
I think that there is something else that is happening, right? So with the Zappos VIPs, for instance, for the top tiers, they have some type of service that is a little bit more geared towards a VIP type of customer. So they have 1 business day shipping, 1 business day delivery, sorry. They have a few other perks. But what they really like is the fact that they order today and they get the item tomorrow. Not with COVID though. So yes, the bulk of Zappos customers understood and adapted. The VIP customers, because they have a higher level of expectations, their expectations haven't lowered to the bar yet. They're still not happy because for X many years we have treated them a certain way, and now that is degrading. And no amount of COVID notices on a website is going to change that.
Yeah, I think that's where another aspect of customer research comes to mind, which is the quantification of those attitudes. Because Paul, you brought up a really good insight, right, about customers being empathetic back to us, right? But some of them. So I personally have not done the quantitative research, right, which is usually done through massive surveys to quantify this. So I don't think, as an empiricist, I can say that we don't know how many customers hold what type of expectation, but that's a good example of more of a qualitative insight that, okay, some customers are empathetic, some are not, right? But I'm not sure that we really know, right? Because we haven't, unless, somebody else has done that work.
And it's interesting because now we're talking more in the research when it comes to attitudinal, right, behavior, as and And when we look at those types of things, that is a research, how would you say, principle that gets applied to understanding your customers, basically on the attitude level.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, and surveys are the only tool we have now to scale that up, right? To measure it to the scale. It's not perfect, right? But, and we also have another tool, which is the voice of the customer feedback loop,
Yep.
which we track sentiment. And it did have an effect. I mean, like you can say that overall people are not happy with the slips in our value propositions, because we're talking about core value propositions here, right? It's not something that it's nice to have, but it's really core proposition. But I think it's a good discussion, right? To the point is having good understanding, and again proves the whole concept of not all customers are not all the same. Some are going to be understanding, some are not going to be understanding. And I agree, Zappos has throughout the years amassed a group of really awesome, dedicated, loyal, understanding customers. And then, but we shouldn't take them for granted.
I'm also wondering if there is a breaking point to where we have not necessarily just Zappos, but some of these businesses like Zappos or other retailers, even Amazon. Is there a point, do you think, where we erode the trust so much that we lose these customers?
You know, that's a really great point, because I find it to be very situational, like meaning that if we're all in the same situation, it's not like going to vendor A from vendor B or vendor C is really going to make any impact, right? You know, and if we're all in that same situation together, it would be pretty much hopefully an understanding of like, okay, this is all going to pass across the entire, global world that we live in, and this is eventually going to iron itself out. But if it was situational for one organization or one company, yeah, it'd be kind of more like, okay, forget this sucks, I'm out. But since we're all in it, it's almost like that kind of, just wait for the tide to pass before it all gets back to normal. And I think the major I was going to say KPI, but one of the major indicators to this is that how do we as an organization come out of this with flying colors, right? As opposed to just continuing on with what we have, right? What do we change in our process? What do we, do within our systems to improve upon things, right? I mean, if you look at even my toilet paper example, they've gone back and streamlined that process to be much more effective and much more efficient, that when this happens again, right, well, I'm going to say if or when, but it most likely will, that we're not sitting here with empty shelves again, that we can have a system in play. And I think when we look at companies and organizations, who are going to be the strongest in that, right? And who's going to lead that show to everybody that I'm glad you're staying with us. This is why you stayed with us, because, we've not only fixed this problem, but we're past it and we've improved upon it. And that's where I think you'll start building a lot of that loyalty. That would be my thinking. So when I look at UX as well, that's kind of my thought process in that. And as a UXer, we have a responsibility to our customers and to our users to do just such a thing. And if we're not doing that, I don't think we're going to be doing our jobs.
That's a good point. And in this case, right, you see, let's take the pandemic example again. In this case, it's such an uneven effect on businesses, right? So online businesses are thriving, right? And in-person businesses are really suffering. So in this case, Amazon is a prime example, thriving, right? Because they invested in this years ago, before this was a thing, and they for 7 years were taking hits, right, and being ridiculed and so on, that it's a bad idea and so and whatnot, right, until now they're proved all the critics wrong, right? But you can imagine, let's say we do a thought experiment that in a few years some solar event happens and takes out all the internet, right? Then we're going to be in that position, right? We're going to be in that position, and then retail stores are going to be thriving. There won't be any online commerce, right? It's going to go away immediately, overnight, right? So then what? Right. So I think it's not unthinkable. I mean, if you think of a thought experiment, right? So I don't know. It's
That's a great way of putting it. Because everybody thinks digital, right? But this could not also mean digital, right? This
yeah,
could also mean actual stores and things like that. Even that toilet paper example, there was nothing digital about that. It's just more like we got to improve our process to make sure that we can get this stuff out the doors faster. And that's the same thing. If we were, and so when we look at this and we think about the monopoly example that Alex was mentioning earlier, I mean, it's interesting because that won't matter if you don't have everything in play, right? The tides could change very quickly. So no matter what kind of business you have or what problem you're trying to solve, it's all about making it the most efficient and most effective, experience that you can do. And at the end of it, if something was to go south, hopefully you have enough measurements in play and that you're not on the other end of the spectrum, that you can still deliver. And it's
yeah,
really fascinating.
exactly. And it's not about having data, because you go. I mean, to take your toilet paper example, we go to Costco here, right? And it's a go to retailer. They ran out the first time, and now they ran out again. They ran out again, right? So with all the big data, with all the data they have, they're tracking everything. What happened, right? And now even this second time was not even it was just anticipation of something happening, of maybe the election turmoil or whatnot, or maybe another potential spike. It again, we ran out. So this to me tells me we're not near ready for anything that's even. I mean, we have movies there that show real, like really gnarly disasters, right? Like sci-fi movies and so on. I mean, what if something like that happened? And I mean, let's take it to now understanding the psychology of the consumer. You have the data of purchasing and so on. You have the data for what's in the news, what's coming. And why can't retailers predict that? Say, you know what, we know people freak out, and then there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to start, amassing things like squirrels, right? They're getting ready for the nuclear winter or whatever. And they anticipate that, and then they think ahead of time, right? And maybe as soon as they see people carrying 3 or 4 packets each, they say, stop that and start rationing it, right? This I think is thinking holistically, not just run your business, order whatever, and then until it runs out, then we'll order again. That's not right. That's not using data. That's not using insights about the psychology of people.
Alex, how can people find you? Where can people find you?
They can find me working at home. But I'm not going to give out my address.
I'll do that.
I'm on LinkedIn. If you type in Alex Genov, I'm going to come up. LinkedIn is the best place for me.
And that's the end of my chat with Paul and Alex. Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to The Industry of UX from your favorite podcast app. And you can check out theindustryofux.com for show notes, episode details, and to leave a comment or feedback. You can also make a small donation or buy our new gorgeous stickers on our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/theindustryofux. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving weekend.